The Festool Domino is a revolutionary machine, but which one makes sense in your shop? The DF500 or the XL DF700? Let's take a closer look and find out. Before we get into the details, let me give you my conclusion. I believe that for the majority of shops, the DF500 is going to meet all your needs. The reason I say this is because it can handle projects that are small, from small boxes up to household furniture, tables, chairs, chests, all of those kinds of projects. If you typically deal in 3/4 sheet goods, 4/4 material, up to 8/4 thick stock, the DF500 is going to meet all of those needs. Now, I'm not saying there's not a place for the DF700, there absolutely is. So let's dive into the details and see which machine makes sense for you. A quick recap on the Festool Domino is that it creates mortises for a floating tenon joint. Now, floating tenon joint is a very traditional joint. It's just we're going to cut it a lot faster and more accurately using this tool. A floating tenon joint has two mortises in the pieces of wood that you're joining and has a floating tenon glued between those mortises to create the joint. In this case, we're going to call that tenon a domino. Now, you can buy pre-made dominoes to stick in that joint, or you can make your own in your shop. The biggest difference between these two tools in front of me is the size of the cutter or the thickness of those mortises that it creates. So let's go ahead and take a look at that first. The DF500 can use the following cutter sizes: small 4mm, 5mm, 6mm, 8mm, and I have installed a 10mm. The DF700 can use an 8mm and 10mm. I've got installed a 12mm and it goes up to a massive 14mm cutter. Now, these cutter ranges obviously relate to the thickness of the domino or floating tenon that can be used in the joint. For a typical joint holding two pieces of wood together, you want that mortise and associated floating tenon or domino to be about 1/3 of the thickness of the material that you're cutting. So for a 3/4 inch material, you generally want to use that 8mm cutter. Now, both the DF500 and the DF700 have 8 and 10mm cutters, so you can handle that 3/4 or 1 inch types of material. However, if you go down in thickness to 1/2 inch material for panels, drawer sides, smaller boxes, the DF500 can handle that with these smaller ranges of cutters. Obviously, going the other way, up to 8/4 material and slabs of wood, joining thick pieces, the DF700 will excel at those projects. Once you make the mortises using the DF500 or the 700, of course, you're going to use a domino that exactly fits that same size. So the range we have here for the DF500 starts down at a very small 4mm thickness, 5mm, 6mm, 8mm, and 10mm. For the DF700, you have the same tenons, 8 and 10mm, 12mm, up to a massive 14mm thick tenon. The next big difference between these two machines is not just the thickness, but the depth of cut, or how deep a mortise you can make. With the DF500, it's almost 1.25 inches, so the bit comes out almost 1.25 inches for making that deep of a mortise into each piece that you're joining. The DF700, by contrast, comes out a massive 2 3/4 inches, so you can get a really deep cut, leaving a lot of glue surface for a really strong joint. So therefore, with the DF500, you get tenons that go up almost 1.25 inches into each piece of wood for that joint, whereas for the 700, you can get a 5-inch long tenon across that joint. One application I want to bring up at this point is alignment of panels. Whether it's edge gluing sheet goods or solid woods, it's a typical operation in the shop for making larger panels from smaller widths of wood. To help with the alignment, you can use dominoes to avoid having to place cauls above and below to keep the pieces flat across the joint. The DF500 is going to excel at this, since you'll typically want to use smaller dominoes in that operation. Another factor to consider between these two machines is the size and handling. The DF500 is around 7 pounds, and you can see it's quite a bit smaller than the XL700. I find it extremely easy to pick up, to move around, use around the shop. Holding it here by the back is very easy. The XL700 is just that little bit bigger. It comes in at just over 11 pounds, so 4 pounds heavier than the 500, and overall it's just a bigger machine for handling and storing. Comes in a larger sustainer for storing in your shop and moving around. However, I will say the plunge mechanism on both of these is extremely smooth. I was especially impressed with this 700, even with the bit spinning, very smooth to plunge it in and make a mortise, which makes it really easy to make very accurate cuts with both of these machines. So overall, you can see that the 500 is just that little bit easier for moving around as compared to the 700. Of course, cost is always a factor, and the DF500 is cheaper than the 700. It's about 30% cheaper than the larger machine. So that's obviously something important to consider when deciding which tool is right for your shop. A couple other notes about these two machines. There is an overlap at the 8mm and 10mm cutters. So both sizes of cutters can be used in these two machines so that thickness of domino can be used with either machine. However, remember that there's a massive difference in the plunge or depth of cut with the 700. So you're going to get a lot more glue surface even at the 8 and 10mm thickness of domino, leading to a much stronger joint. Another factor with the DF500 in thicker materials, like an 8/4 type of material, is that you can create very strong joints by stacking dominoes. So you make multiple mortises across a single joint, use multiple tenons across that joint, and create a very strong joint even in thicker materials. Now, you won't get as near a depth of cut or plunging nearly as deep as the 700, but even in that larger material, you can still use the 500 by stacking dominoes. So which one is right for your shop? Only you can make that decision. I think the DF500 makes sense in a lot of shops, working in 3/4 material, 1 inch, up to 8/4 thick materials, making regular household size furniture. If you deal with big slabs of wood, making large conference tables, or using big timbers in woodworking projects, the DF700 is super awesome. Of course, you can always find more information about these two machines at highlandwoodworking.com. If you have any questions or want to add to the discussion, leave a comment. And always feel free to drop us a line. Let us know which machine belongs in your shop.